Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about statistics and studies. And doesn't that sound fun? And specifically, I'd like to have a bit of a think about how traditional news media reports on studies, as well as what you see here on YouTube. And our lab rat who's going to be helping us out today is YouTuber Black Pigeon Speaks, and why him? Well, in me opinion, Black Pigeon Speaks is consistently among the most shameless in his misuse of sources and statistics. And the video I'm going to feature here, Something is Rotten in the State Denmark, is particularly bad for it. So then, this video. Well, first of all, I'd like to apologize to Denmark on behalf of me fellow countryman, William Shakespeare, for how often I imagine they have to hear that sentence. It must be terrifically annoying. I imagine scarcely anything can happen in Denmark without some chump quoting that line. But anyway, what is this video about? Well, it doesn't really matter, to be honest. It's just another in Black Pigeon Speaks long line of anti-immigrant videos where he explains how if you let a single non-white person into your country, it turns into murder or something. Today's country is Denmark, but he's made similar videos proclaiming the imminent downfall of Sweden, Germany, the United States, etc. You know, the same old rubbish. What I am interested in this video are the statistics and sources that Black Pigeon cites at the start of the video. And let's take a look at that. But are they true? There are many examples of studies that refute not only these common assertions, but in fact demonstrate that not only does mass immigration not help destination countries, but in fact becomes a major financial burden for the native tax-paying population. In Canada, for example, a recent long-term study has shown that immigrants impose a huge fiscal burden on Canadian taxpayers. This is the result of immigrants paying about half as much in income tax as other Canadians, but absorbing nearly the same value of government services, costing taxpayers roughly $6,051 per immigrant and amounting to a total annual cost of somewhere between $16.03 billion and $23.06 billion. These findings are also mirrored in the Correlates, where an authoritative study by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine found that immigration drains the government, sapping as much as $296 billion a year from the federal, state, and local taxpayers, while depressing wages, at least in the short run. The data shows that immigrants take more in benefits than they pay in taxes. Although immigrants do boost the size of the economy, the gains are heavily skewed toward the immigrants themselves and to wealthy investors, not to native-born workers who end up competing with the new arrivals. The same can be said in the UK, where a recent report concluded that migrants contributed much less in taxes than they used in government services, and like in Canada, the class immigrants on the whole are a negative drain upon the countries they enter. The crippling £17 billion annual shortfall in the UK is pretty much replicated in every country that is targeted with mass immigration. The problem with these studies is that regardless of being nonpartisan, regardless of being bulletproof in terms of statistics and conclusions, there will always be those on the left that want to continue to import new dependent voter blocks and those on the right that want to import a more malleable and cheaper workforce that drives down wages, that somehow the numbers are being skewed. So Black Pigeon rattles off a few pro-immigrant arguments and then says they invalid because they refuted by the stats, and he cites 3 studies which are supposedly nonpartisan and statistically bulletproof. Those studies being, in America, the economic and fiscal consequences of immigration by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine; in Canada, immigration and the Canadian Welfare State 2011 by the Fraser Institute; and in the The fiscal effects of immigration to the book 2014-15 by the very non-part immigrant So let's take a look at these three papers and test out just how statistically bulletproof they are. And we'll do the most fun one first, which is the American one, because why not? Now I like this one the most because in his introduction there, Black Pigeon railed against the supposed pro-immigrant narrative of Western governments, academia, and, quote, but then to counter that narrative, he cites a Washington Times article talking about an academic research paper put out by the national academies. So if the press, governments, and academics want to push a pro-immigrant message, they seemingly shot themselves in the foot this time. Or have they? You see, the other fun thing here is that Black Pigeon shows the results of this study via a stupid headline on a biased conservative news website. Now, we're not gonna do that. We're gonna cut out the middleman and go right to the source and read the press release that the authors of the report put out alongside it. And I'm gonna read the whole summary of this report's conclusions here, just so you can be sure I'm not missing anything out. Who are often the closest substitutes for immigrant workers with low skills. There is little evidence that immigration significantly affects the overall employment levels of native-born workers. As with wage impacts, there is some evidence that recent immigrants reduce the employment rate of prior immigrants. In addition, recent research finds that immigration reduces the numbers of hours worked by native teens, but not their employment levels. Some evidence on inflow of skilled immigrants suggests that there may be positive wage effects for some subgroups of native-born workers, and other benefits to the economy more broadly. Immigration has an overall positive impact on long-run economic growth in the U.S. In terms of fiscal impacts, first-generation immigrants are more costly to governments, mainly at the state and local levels, than are the native-born, in large part due to the costs of educating their children. However, as adults, the children of immigrants, the second generation, are among the strongest economic and fiscal contributors in the U.S. population, contributing more in taxes than either their parents or the rest of the native-born population. Over the long term, the impacts of immigrants on government budgets are generally positive at the federal level, but remain negative at the state and local level, but these generalizations are subject to a number of important assumptions. Immigration's fiscal effects vary tremendously across states. I am done. So, to summarize the summary there, immigration has an overall positive impact on the economy, although there can be short-term negative effects on a local level, depending on various factors. And I'm not an expert by any means, but I have had to read a few similar studies in the course of me time here on the internet, and this is the result they generally all come to. Well, the reputable ones anyway, the ones that aren't put out by think tanks with names like Migration Watch. So then, Black Pigeon, there's your first bulletproof source, the one that came to the conclusion that immigration is a net positive for the economy. However, you might be wondering, how did the Washington Times read all this and then put out a story with the headline, "Mass Immigration Costs Government $296 billion a year depresses wages"? You know why not. New study finds immigrants have positive impact on economy. Well, that's because they very, very sneaky. You see, at one point, the paper in question examines the spread of 8 alternate scenarios for measuring the fiscal impact of immigration in 2013 and controlling for various factors. They get 8 different results. And I'm gonna reuse something right now from that section. That probably isn't gonna make much sense, but here we go. Most, but not all, of the increase in the fiscal ratio for the first-generation group is linked to the change in the public goods assumption that results in vastly reduced federal spending on this group from an estimate of $9,000 per individual in Scenario 1 down to $6,000 in Scenario 5, a reduction that raises the ratio of receipts to outlays from 0.7 to 1.1. Now, to translate, depending on how you measure the impact of immigration, you can wind up with different results. And in the best case scenarios, immigrants pay more to the federal government than they receive back, and in the worst case scenarios the opposite is true. So, a question. Where do you imagine the Washington Times got this figure from? Was it from the worst possible projected scenario? Yes, it was. Of course it was. So, the study came up with a range of 8 different possibilities, and the Washington Times cherry-picked the worst one and then wrote a headline that made it look like that was the overall result of the study. Highly sneaky behavior there. However, as awful as it is, the Washington Times at least divulges that this is how it came up with the figure in the headline, and also quotes the leader of the panel that wrote the study, saying Francine Bluff, the Cornell University economics professor who led the academic panel, insisted the findings showed American workers had little to fear from immigration. And the article also ends with a quote from the Center for American Progress, arguing that deporting immigrants would harm the economy more than it would help. And this is something that a lot of these newspaper pieces do, you know, end with a quote from an opposing viewpoint as a pretense of neutrality or bipartisanship or something. how I news of you the about I will I'll do without to view you passive body view one who no So, they've still got the misleading headline in there with a clear BS, but at the very least, the text itself does quote some opposing voices. Not so for Black Pigeon, though, who doesn't mention how the Washington Times came up with the figure in the headline, or quote the head of the panel that created the paper. No doubt Black Pigeon would disagree with her conclusion that Americans have little to fear from immigration. She is an academic after all. And it's amazing, really. Black Pigeon will appeal to the authority of academics for a minute, and then dismiss them as out of touch, over-educated progressives the next. And it's a tricky thing to bash ivory tower academics as having a pro-immigrant BS while simultaneously using their research to make an anti-immigrant point, but props to Black Pigeon. The madman actually did it. Anyway, that's enough of the us study for now. Let's move on to the other two, the ones from Canada and the Gook. And these two actually come to conclusions that support Black Pigeon's arguments, amazingly enough. They do say immigrants cost the economy relative to the native population. But before we get to those, and here's the first thing. Let's consider a 20-year-old immigrant into the book from France, say, and compare him to a 20-year-old British citizen who was born here. Now, let's imagine it that from then on, they live the exact same life. They get the same jobs on the same day. They live in the same house in the same town. They work the same hours for the same wages for the same period of time. And then they die. Rip to those two imaginary people I just made up. So a question, then, of those two people over their lifetimes, which one was more beneficial to the British economy? Now, you might think they re exactly the same. The only difference is that one of them was born in France. Everything else was identical. But that's overlooking something, and that's the British guy's childhood. For 2 decades, while he was working because he was too young, he was supported by taxes. His education, his health care, welfare payments, wear and tear on infrastructure, whatever, all paid for by the taxpayer. For the first however many years of his working life, he's essentially paying back the cost of his childhood. Not so for the French guy. France paid to keep him alive for 20 years. The chumps. And then he came over here and started working and paying taxes in our country. Unlike the British guy, he's an immediate benefit to the economy. So that's the first hurdle there. If we consider lifetime costs when comparing immigrants to the native population, immigrants have a big head start. And here's the next hurdle. As noted in the study we just looked at, immigration can have short-term negative effects on a local level. Let's imagine a town in the Cook that has exactly enough builders, say, to do all the building work required. And then a bunch of immigrants move to that town, most of whom are builders themselves. Now, that's going to have the effect of driving down wages for builders there, as well as probably reducing their hours worked. Now, the reason we say this is a short-term negative effect is because over time this situation remedies itself. You see, all of those extra immigrant builders need clothes, food, housing, entertainment, transportation, etc. And the increased demand for all of those things leads to those areas expanding and taking on more people. So for every job an immigrant takes, they create a job by way of their increasing the demand for various goods and services. So we come to the hurdle. If considered over a long enough period of time, any localized short-term negative effects of immigration average out and disappear. But as a side note here, this still sucks for the original builders who were put out of work, of course. And I'm sure it wouldn't to be much solace to tell them, oh, don't worry, you might be out of a job right now, but trust me, it's good for the economy in the long run. Certain people, depending on where they live and what they work as, it can have perfectly legitimate worries about immigration, and these worries probably do too often get dismissed as just working-class racism. And to be fair, a lot of the time there is a lot of racism mixed in there as well, and it can be hard to see past that, but there is often a real economic worry there. Now the trick is to recognize who is at fault here and blame the system and the government for lying about the effects of immigration and not having adequate protections for people who are put out of work, rather than blaming the immigrants themselves, who, well, they didn't see vet up society this way. They re just individuals trying to get by like anyone else. Anyway, now a third hurdle is this. In times of recession, the native non-immigrant population of a country also take out more than they put in because it's a recession. So if the years you choose to measure the cost of immigration are the years immediately following a recession, you might end up with figures that say immigrants are a net loss for the economy. But that might also be true for the non-immigrant population for that time period too. But we'll talk more about this when we get to the Vcodec report. So how would someone trying to deliberately come up with numbers that say immigration is a net loss for the economy get around all of these problems? And to be clear here, the authors of the next two reports are the Fraser Institute, which is a libertarian think tank in Canada, and Migration Watchdog, which is a right-wing pressure group in the Vcodec. They want to come up with stats that say immigration is a drain on the economy, so they can get all those juicy tabloid headlines. So how would one go about it? Well, the main tactic is something that I like to call stat cropping, which I'm sure there's an actual term for, but I don't know it. It's the same tactic used by climate change deniers to, quote, debunk global warming. For example, if we look at this NASA graph of global surface temperature change in its entirety, the overall upwards trend is quite clear, but we can cherry-pick specific date ranges contained within it to show instead a cooling trend. So the Earth either showed no temperature change or actually got cooler between the years of 1970 to 77, 77 to 86, 87 to 96, 97 to 2002, 2003 to 2012, and 2012 to 2014. Hey, sell you to sell should you to should you to view you view to you put put the tell you to Oh, big thanks to Skeptical Science Com for the graphs there. So what's me point here? Well, by examining only very specific date ranges and not looking at the whole picture, you can come up with whatever results you like, and the same holds true for examining the economic impact of migration. So with this stat cropping concept in mind, let's go to Canada and check out the Fraser Institute report. So this report is Immigration and the Canadian Welfare State 2011 by Herbert Grubel and Patrick Grady. And it's worth noting here that Black Pigeon Speaks again shows the findings of the report via a news headline, this time from the National Post. And this article starts out by saying the report was immediately criticized as telling only part of the story. And it also quotes Herbert Grubel, the report's author, as saying, "We are not here as a country to do charity for the rest of the world." Sounds like a lovely chap. So why was this report criticized as only telling part of the story? Well, let's read a report about this report. Its reportception. So this is Fiscal Transfers to Immigrants in Canada by Mohsin Javdani and Krishna Pendikar. I am sorry for butchering those names there, probably. And this report starts out as follows. One of the common issues contested by analysts and policymakers is whether immigrants fully pay in terms of taxes for the public services they use. The Fraser Institute recently released a study that estimates the fiscal burden created by immigrants arriving in Canada between 1987 and 2004. The central finding in this study is that in the fiscal year 2005-2006, immigrants on average received in excess of $6,000 in benefits over taxes paid, or as high as $23 billion per year for the nearly $4 million post-Minnesota 1,986 immigrants to Canada. This brief report identifies some of the issues related to the internal and external validity of the study performed by Grady and Grubel. There are a number of errors and inconsistencies in their analysis, and this report presents a corrected estimate of the fiscal transfer that they sought to estimate. And let's read a few of their conclusions. Grady and Grubel present results on the fiscal transfer between all Canadian residents and recent immigrants, as defined as the difference in taxes paid between these groups, less the difference in benefits received. They find essentially no difference in benefits received between all Canadian residents and immigrants. We also find that immigrants who arrived between 1987 and 2004 received similar benefits on average to those received by all Canadian residents. Since benefits are found to be similar between groups, their results hinges on the large estimate of the difference in taxes paid, which is $6,000 and change per immigrant. However, the results presented by Grady and Grubel on taxes paid have arithmetic errors, apparently typographical in origin. Correcting these arithmetic errors results in the difference of $5,473 in taxes paid per immigrant. So, off to a good start there. Grady and Grubel investigate only recent immigrants who are younger than the immigrant population as a whole. To the extent that their youth results in lower incomes and their lower incomes result in lower tax revenues, it would be revealing to examine the entire immigrant population so as to capture their entire life cycle of incomes. If one investigates the taxes paid by immigrants who entered Canada between 1970 and 2004, instead of between 1987 and 2004, we see a difference of $2,470 per immigrant. We also find that immigrants who entered Canada between 1970 and 2004 receive an average of $345 less in benefits than do all Canadian residents. And here's why I mentioned stat cropping earlier. The authors are only considering recent immigrants who are generally younger and poorer and therefore pay less tax. When you consider the whole immigrant population, as this report does, you get a very different number. But that isn't Grady and Grubel's only trick with the numbers there. The next one is particularly shocking. We also argue that comparing the taxes paid by immigrants to those of all Canadian residents and computing a fiscal transfer is somewhat misleading because the group of all Canadian residents includes immigrants. Therefore, it's not a transfer from one group to another. Apart from the Canadian-born residents and immigrants who entered Canada between 1987 and 2004, the sample of all Canadian residents also includes non-immigrant residents, immigrants who entered Canada before 1987, and immigrants who entered Canada in 2005. These people are irrelevant to the calculation of fiscal transfer and serve only to bias the results. A more relevant comparison would be between taxes paid by Canadian-born people and those paid by immigrants. For immigrants who entered Canada between 1970 and 2004, the difference is $26.96 per immigrant. Turning to the benefit received, we find that these immigrants received an average of $554 less in benefit than did the Canadian-born. So what does all that mean? Well, Grady and Grubel aren't measuring the immigrant population against the native-born population. They remeasuring the recent young immigrant population against the population of Canadian residents as a whole, which includes the older, richer immigrants. So once the immigrants become sufficiently old and rich, they count as non-immigrants in this study for purposes of making the more recent immigrants look like more of an economic burden. It's highly deceptive there. And this trick worked. The National Post article starts out, "Immigrants to Canada impose a huge fiscal burden on Canadian taxpayers," while failing to mention that those Canadian taxpayers also include immigrants. And the report goes on, pointing out Grady and Grubel's other calculation errors and misleadingly cropped sample sizes, and comes to the conclusion that they were off in their estimation of the cost of immigration by about a factor of 10. So, well done, lads. And it's worth noting here that this report by Jav Darnay and Penderker got significantly less exposure in the press than did the original report by Grady and Grubel, which of course was the point. Once they got the headline, they won, basically. So there's your second bulletproof source, Black Pigeon, the one with the mathematical errors that reclassifies richer immigrants as non-immigrants and has since been torn apart. Brilliant. Now let's go to the book and check out the Migration Watch report, and let's play a game with this one that I'm gonna call reverse telephone. So this headline featured in Black Pigeon's video bombshell report. Immigration costing Britain 17 So this paper is an extension of the 2014 paper, The Fiscal Effects of Immigration to the UK, authored by Dustman and Frattini, and put out by UCL's Center for Research and Analysis of Migration. Right. Do you have all that? Do you have all? No, you have all Okay, so let's first take a look at the original report, and then we'll work backwards from there. And the organization that released the report reported on the release of the report in the following way. That was an awkward sentence, wasn't it? European immigrants to the UK have paid more in taxes than they received in benefits, helping to relieve the fiscal burden on UK-born workers and contributing to the financing of public services, according to new research by the UCLA Center for Research and Analysis of Migration, CREAM. European immigrants who arrived in the UK since the year 2000 have contributed more than £20 billion to the UK public finances between 2001 and 2011. Moreover, they have endowed the country with productive human capital that would have cost the UK £6 8 billion in spending on education. Hey, that's the point we made earlier about the cost of education. Isn't that neat? Anyway, this report also contains several graphs that measure immigrants' impact on the economy relative to natives, and you can see the big drop around 2008 there due to the financial crisis, and indeed, the native population is contributing less than they receive. So we have a University College London report there that came to the conclusion that immigration is a net positive for the economy. Now, the report in Black Pigeon's video put out by Migration Watch claims to be an extension of Dustman and Frattini 2014 that applies their methodology to a more recent year, but somehow comes to the opposite result, that migrants are a drain on the economy. So how did they manage that? Well, quoting from their abstract, they say, some slight differences in assumptions have been made in the interests of greater accuracy. So what were these slight differences? You might be wondering. Well, we can read the Center for Research and Analysis of Migration's response to the Migration Watch report and see exactly what they think of it. Migration Watch has extended our analysis of the fiscal impact of immigration to the UK to fiscal year 2014. a year for which the data were not available when we wrote our paper. However, while they claim to replicate our analysis in most points, they only consider that specific year, rather than computing the cumulative fiscal contributions of all immigrants who arrived since the year 2000, as we did. What Migration Watch did was just choose 1 year only, 2014. Choose was year was This tells us the rate at which the cumulative contribution of immigrants is growing in 2014 only. This is certainly a less interesting question than the one we posed. For that particular year, they show that immigrants who arrived since the year 2000 make a roughly neutral net contribution. It would remain true that the cumulative contribution over the last 15 years must be positive. It should also be noted that the net fiscal contribution of immigrants, even for that 1 year, is still higher than that of natives. In fact, Migration Watch estimates that in 2014, natives contribute to the exchequer about 85% of what they cost, thus making a substantial negative fiscal contribution. A couple of additional points are worth noting. The central scenario analyzed by Migration Watch is one where recent immigrants are assumed to make no contribution to corporate taxes. However, as we discussed in our study, the allocation of corporate taxes and business rates raises complicated questions of incidence. The fact that businesses write the checks does not mean that the burdens do not ultimately fall on consumers or workers. In fact, there is a literature in economics that suggests it is workers and consumers who ultimately pay the major share of such taxes, if not all. Our analysis was taking no stance on this debate. Apportioning capital and corporate tax payments net of the percentage likely to be paid by foreign shareholders on a per capita basis among the adult population. When Migration Watch adopts this assumption, which we believe is more realistic and grounded in economic evidence, they find that recent immigrants have made an overall fiscal contribution of £1 5 million in 2014. So, what did we just learn there? Well, firstly, Migration Watch aped the methodology of a study that was designed to measure the impact of immigration over the decade since the year 2000, and applied it to study just 1 year in particular. And this is, strictly academically speaking, very silly. Next, they worked from the assumption that immigrants do not contribute to corporation tax at all. And it turns out, when you make the assumption that immigrants don't pay taxes, it skews the numbers somewhat. Some slight differences in assumptions have been made indeed. This one is just sad, to be honest. Migration Watch is trying to ride the coattails of an actual legitimate academic paper by twisting its methodology and making heavily biased assumptions in order to come to the opposite conclusion. It's the old appeal to authority while rejecting that authority's conclusions game again. The Migration Watch report doesn't even have a listed author. It's embarrassing, frankly. So there's your third bulletproof source, Black Pigeon. So there's your the pressure group study without an author that makes the small assumption that immigrants don't pay any taxes. But hey, they got the headline. And that's all that counts, really, isn't it? Res, bell, real, bell, 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 So have you noticed the pattern here? The studies released by government or university academic researchers come to the conclusion that migration is generally positive for the economy. Studies released by right-wing think tanks and pressure groups, on the other hand, come to the conclusion that migration is negative for the economy, but only by deliberately selecting certain date ranges and particular immigrant demographics that allow them to come to that conclusion. And I'd like to ask, can we not reverse the logic of Black Pigeon Speaks' introduction to his video? He says these bulletproof sources prove pro-immigration arguments wrong, but far from being bulletproof, these sources are actually riddled with bullet holes. You know, they rubbish. So can we therefore conclude that the pro-immigration arguments check out? Yes. Yes, we can. Thanks a lot for watching, everyone. This video wasn't about ancient Rome. I am sorry, I promised my next video was gonna be about Rome. But that one was taken a while, you see, so what I did was I made this one instead. Expect the Rome video in the next few weeks, probably. Thanks as always to all me supporters over on Patreon. I couldn't keep making these videos without your support, and I am incredibly grateful and genuinely thank you all. And for anyone else, if you'd like to help support more videos like this, head over to Patreon and send me $1 or $2. The link will be in the description there. Also follow me on Twitter and all that jazz, if you like. Right. Thanks a lot, everyone. See you next time.